In the early hours of September 26, 1983, the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than anyone could have imagined. The Cold War was at its peak, and the balance of terror between the United States and the Soviet Union hung on a knife's edge. In Moscow, leaders spoke openly about the threat of an American first strike. In Washington, military planners drew up scenarios of Soviet aggression. Missiles stood ready on both sides, their warheads powerful enough to erase civilization in less than an hour. And in the middle of this powder keg sat a single man, stationed in a darkened control room just outside of Moscow, staring at a computer screen that suddenly declared the unthinkable. The United States had launched a nuclear attack. His name was Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. To history, he would become known as the man who saved the world. But on that night, he was just another officer doing his duty in a secret bunker buried deep underground, tasked with one of the most terrifying responsibilities imaginable: deciding whether to report a nuclear strike to the Soviet High Command. His decision, made in less than a minute, would determine the fate of hundreds of millions of lives. The system he monitored was called OKO, the Soviet Union's early warning satellite network. It was designed to detect missile launches from American silos and submarines. The logic was simple. If the United States launched an attack, the Soviets had only minutes to respond before the missiles struck their targets. Petrov's orders were clear. If the computer signaled a launch, he was to notify his superiors immediately, who would almost certainly order a retaliatory strike. The doctrine was known as MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, and it left no room for hesitation. At exactly 12:15 a.m., the silence of the control room shattered. A piercing alarm blared through the speakers. The screen in front of Petrov lit up with a single word: launch. According to the satellite system, one American intercontinental ballistic missile was speeding toward the Soviet Union. The officers in the room froze. Faces turned pale. Years of training had prepared them for this moment, but no amount of drills could capture the horror of seeing the alert flash in real time. Petrov's duty was simple: pick up the phone, call the high command, and report the launch. Within minutes, the Soviet leadership would have to decide whether to retaliate, unleashing their own arsenal of thousands of nuclear warheads. The world's fate balanced on a thread thinner than anyone could comprehend. But Petrov hesitated. He stared at the screen. One missile. Just one. His instincts told him something was wrong. Why would the United States fire a single missile, knowing it would invite total retaliation? If America truly intended to destroy the Soviet Union, they would fire hundreds, maybe thousands, all at once. One launch made no sense, but the system was insistent. The satellite data was clear. A missile had been launched. Then, a second alert appeared. A second missile was on its way. Then a third. Then a fourth. The control room descended into panic. Officers clutched their heads, some whispering prayers under their breath. This was a nightmare scenario they had feared for years. The system was now screaming that 5 missiles were inbound from the United States, each carrying enough destructive power to level a city. Petrov's hand hovered over the phone. If he called it in, the Soviet leadership would have only minutes to react. Standard procedure meant an immediate counterstrike. Thousands of warheads launched across the Atlantic, obliterating every major American city, followed by retaliation that would vaporize Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and countless others. Billions would die. Civilization itself could collapse. But again, Petrov hesitated. He noticed something strange. The OKO system was new and its reliability had never been fully tested. The ground-based radar stations, designed to confirm any satellite detection, showed nothing. The sky was clear, no radar contact, only the satellite's word that the missiles existed. Petrov's gut told him it was a false alarm. He thought of his training as an engineer, of the fallibility of machines. Computers could make mistakes. And he thought of the consequences if he was wrong. If he ignored the alert and the missiles were real, he would doom his nation to destruction. If he reported it and the system was wrong, he would start World War III. The clock ticked. Minutes felt like hours. Sweat poured down Petrov's face. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He knew the high command was expecting his report. The officers around him looked at him with pleading eyes, desperate for him to make the call. And then, in an act of defiance against both procedure and fear, Stanislav Petrov made his decision. He picked up the phone, not to report the attack, but to declare it a false alarm. The room fell silent. Every man present knew the weight of what he had just done. If he was wrong, they would all be dead within minutes. But Petrov refused to believe the United States had launched a handful of missiles in a suicidal first strike. He trusted his instincts over the machine. And then, slowly, the minutes passed. No explosions. No blinding light on the horizon. No nuclear war. The alarm stopped. The system went quiet. It had been an error. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had fooled the satellites into thinking missiles had been launched. Stanislav Petrov had been right. His refusal to follow protocol had prevented the annihilation of humanity. Yet, in that moment, there were no celebrations. No one in the control room cheered. The all knew how close the world had come to ending, and the all knew that Petrov's decision, if discovered, might not be celebrated at all. For the Soviet Union, his defiance was not heroism, but insubordination. He had disobeyed orders, ignored procedure, and taken a gamble that could have destroyed his nation. In the following days, Petrov was interrogated, scrutinized, and quietly reassigned. His career never advanced. His story remained hidden for decades, buried in the shadows of the Cold War. What the world would later learn is that this was not an isolated incident. The Cold War was filled with moments where miscommunication, paranoia, and human error nearly triggered Armageddon. But on that night in 1983, the fate of the planet came down to one man sitting in a dark control room, trusting his instincts against the might of a machine. Stanislav Petrov never thought of himself as a hero. When he was asked about it years later, he simply shrugged and said, "I was just doing my job." But in truth, his decision remains one of the most consequential acts of courage in human history. Because on that night, when the computers screamed for retaliation and the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war, one man chose to say no. And in doing so, he may have saved us